I was preparing a paper recently, and in a footnote responded to a remark in another paper that it would be unusual to remove a die from production before it was worn out. I commented that is not how mints and dies worked, and I showed that draft to Isa, and well...
Robert, I'm pretty sure you talked about reaching into a basket and pulling out a random die and using it until it was worn out when you first explained this to me.
Oops. Yes, when I first explained intra-die analysis to Isa, and in fact, I realised every time I've explained that to anyone, I have talked about the dies breaking or being worn out, and that is not true. And I know it's not true. So, sorry to everyone I've misled over the years, but I am going to explain why I know it's not true in this episode and what is probably really going on. First of all, why am I saying something that's not true? The comic author Terry Pratchett makes this observation with regard to scientific education, that a lot of what is taught isn't really true. The provocative term Pratchett uses is lies to children, and suggests that that operates in layers, that the first thing you are taught is wrong, but it's simple and easy to understand, and if you continue to learn, you get taught another lie, but one that is more complex and more nuanced. And so on, in a series of more and more complex and presumably less misleading explanations, each one acting as a stepping stone to the next. Some things are just too confusing or complicated for your first sitting. And that is just as true of historical method as it is in the sciences. So yes, at the beginning of my very first explanation of die studies, my description isn't really true. And I'm going to let Isa give that explanation before I go into why we know it's wrong.
To make coins by die striking, you need two dies, an obverse and a reverse. A blank piece of metal is placed between, and the top die, the reverse, is struck with a hammer. The force of that blow, or multiple blows, impresses the negative designs of the dies onto the blank and creates a coin. That process involves a lot of mechanical stresses. So, while you start with two dies paired together to make coins, eventually one of them breaks. The one receiving the hammer blow receives greater forces, and so will break more frequently. The mint discards the broken die and replaces it with a new one. And because the two dies used for a coin are independent, that creates a new pairing, a die link. And over time, the obverse die, or more reverse dies, will break and be replaced, and that will create a chain of links.
Yep, that is almost exactly how I explain it, and it's not just me. My first introduction to the idea was through Otto Morecambe's discussion of it, and Morecambe explains it in very similar terms, talking as if dies break or wear out, and including a diagram of a chain. But that isn't true, and Morecambe knew that.
The chains because of multiple workstations? Here we are assuming just one set of dies being used at a time, but in reality there would probably be more sets in use.
The honest answer is I don't really know. I've looked at enough die studies that I know chains are much rarer than they are usually assumed to be, but I couldn't tell you how common they are or even why they are rare.
Aha! You have no idea what's really going on, and the whole introductory explanation is just papering over a collective disciplinary ignorance.
That's not the most generous interpretation, though it's not particularly inaccurate. There is a lot we do know, but there is also a lot we don't, and that would be confusing the first time you explain this. But while I can't really say why chains are rare, I do have a more complicated answer on the other part of that explanation. Generally speaking, dies did not break, and that is not why they were removed from use. And to get to what was really going on, I should start with some actual examples of dies being worn out.
Great. This is going to be one of those long, circuitous explanations. For anyone who doesn't want Robert's lengthy digression, I'll make sure he puts chapter marks at the bottom of the video and you can skip to the answer.
Thank you, Isa. Let's start with how a die can wear out. There are essentially three ways that a die can mechanically fail. It can, as we were pretending it did in the earlier explanation, fail catastrophically. When the hammer blow lands, it finds some flaw in the metal and literally shatters the die. Experimental archaeologists have reported exactly this phenomena. Some dies just break. We suspect it tends to happen early, and in a competent mint, probably infrequently. It is also possible that gradually the die accumulates enough general wear that it just isn't practical to use it any longer. Striking is a violent process that can deform the die in ways that prevent its use but don't actually destroy it. Third, the die face itself could fail. The end of the die with the design on involves a lot of fine detail, which is easily obliterated. But let us begin with the first two. Mechanical failures of the die, and some actual pre-modern dies. Dies from official mints rarely survive, but there is an exceptional group, over 300, which today are divided between the Public Records Office, the British Museum, and the Royal Mint. The dies come mostly from the reign of Edward III in the 14th century in England, when they were simply forgotten about and left for several centuries in the Abbey or Palace of Westminster. There is an article by Cook which lists those in the British Museum and goes into details of what we know about the group as a whole. But I'm interested in the dies themselves. And here I am in a storeroom in the British Museum looking at those dies. You can see that they come in two types, which are obviously distinct. The Obverse has a spike on the bottom, which can hold it in position in the anvil, while the cylindrical reverse die lacks that spike. That's the section that would receive the hammer blow to the top. Some of these have or are very close to failing catastrophically. This one has a huge crack down the side, and it was this one in particular I wanted to show you. It would likely have been turned into shrapnel by the next hammer blow if it had not been removed from use. That is a really good example of the first type of mechanical failure I just talked about. And this one is a good example of the second type of mechanical failure. We can see that there is still a clear impression of the die face, so that part is still usable, and it's not in immediate danger of catastrophically failing. But the hammer blow has folded over the metal, shortening the die so much you would have difficulty holding it. And you can see it would be really awkward and painful if you were using your hands. And we think most dies were held by hand. You can see the die has buckled along the length, probably from the forces involved, and it has this off-centre indentation that I suspect would make delivering a good blow very difficult. So that's a good example of how a reverse die might become unusable without actually breaking, or the die face failing, but it would still be worn out.
But some of those dies look a lot better. Robert, can you show us that one?
This one? This one here?
Yes, that one. That one is still usable, isn't it? I don't see any damage.
Yes, this one has a working die face. It has not been folded over or even deformed very much at the top. I doubt this one was used very much at all. You can see I can still hold it quite comfortably. In fact, I suspect this die would still be perfectly functional today. Obviously, we are not going to test that. The department were kind enough to let me show you the dies. They would be very upset if I hit one of them with a hammer, even if it was literally designed to be hit by a hammer.
How many of those dies do you think are still usable?
It's tough to say. On some, the die itself is okay, but the die face has fractured or worn out. I think maybe half a dozen or a dozen of the dies I examined were probably still functional, so perhaps a quarter. And obviously it's hard to distinguish actual wear in the 14th century from 600 years of potential corrosion, which is why we will need another example. Those dies show us that dies were often removed without wear to the die itself. But the third way that a die can be worn out is at the die face. The die face, the bit of the die that has the negative impression of the design and is impressed on the coin, is the weakest part of the die. It has a lot of small details with fine ridges, and every time it is impressed onto a coin, there is a huge mechanical stress that can crack, flatten, or distort it. And unlike the other forms of breaking or wearing out, we can see that on the coins themselves, so we don't need an accident like the English dies to study it. And to illustrate the die face wearing out, I'm going to work from an article by Jean-Philippe Fontenelle on the Yehud coins. These coins are amongst a wide range of issues in the 5th to 3rd century BC, which derive from Athenian prototypes. They are generally small and often grotty in appearance.
Is grotty a technical term?
No, grotty is not a technical term. It's just how we usually describe indistinct designs, regardless of why those designs are indistinct. In this case, if you look at a few examples, you might assume they were just worn, or they'd been corroded by being buried for centuries. But Fontenelle showed that wasn't the case. They compared multiple coins from the same dies, an intra-die analysis, to establish a gradual degradation in the design caused by mechanical stresses. There are 3 sequences like this published in the article, 2 from Obverse and 1 from a reverse, and in each intra-die sequence you can see the gradual accumulation of damage to the surface of the die. The most obvious is the crack that appears on the Owl reverse and which grows over time. As well as the crack, there's a general tendency for features to become less distinct. You can see this very clearly on the second Obverse, where what was originally a quite sharply engraved head becomes little more than a rough depression in the surface of the die, and thus a blob on the surface of the coin.
I'm just going to assume blob is another technical term.
Okay, there are a few other examples of these from Persian period Palestine in related series. For example, work by Gittler and Tal. Personally, I have most confidence in Fontenelle's work. Fontenelle is just really, really good at this type of analysis and has done it on other coins as well. But actually, the first time that I encountered this phenomena was through the work of Gittler and Tal, so I thought it was worth mentioning here. What the evidence suggests is that at these mints, at this particular moment, people just kept hitting the same die over and over again until they had totally destroyed the face of the die. Fontenelle wonders if there was a problem with the alloy for the metal, but it doesn't really matter, because as they note, 67% of the specimens were struck by one or the other of these 2 obverse dies, and only around 2% of coins struck by the first obverse show the Athena head in anything like its original depiction. In the case of the second die, 20% of the coins show the original details. Obviously, these percentages are of extant coins, which may not accurately reflect the original numbers, but it's probably indicative. For the bulk of the production, it seems, the workers and probably more importantly, the administrators running the mint could see that the coins did not have a clear design, but simply a vaguely head-shaped blob, and they did not care. More than half the extant coinage was made like this. And the point of this digression, other than obviously, isn't this kind of interesting, is that this is what coinage looks like if the mint just hammers dies until they wear out. And no, this is not what most coins look like. These coinages are exceptional. Yes, wear is seen on most coinages, otherwise intra-die analysis would not be possible, but very few coinages show anything like this level of wear. This is not normal. Dies weren't used to exhaustion.
Okay, I get the point. And the English dies also showed this. But it's not that we think every die is damaged so badly it is unusable. Presumably, most mints had a threshold of wear they were willing to put up with. When a die started to develop a crack, or when the design became too indistinct, the mint takes that die out of use. And surely that is what we really mean when we say that a die is used until it is worn out, that it meets whatever threshold the mint has set. I can see that as an issue, but it is still fundamentally about things wearing out in some sense.
Yeah, this is why I tell the lie at the beginning about breaking, because if I don't, this is the counterpoint that comes up and it completely derails my introduction, which is really supposed to be about telling you about intra-die analysis. And the answer is no, this isn't just semantics. There is good reason to believe this is not what is happening. Yes, the reason mints remove dies is because they are aware there is a finite lifespan to the dies. They will corrode or break or wear out, but they don't actually remove them because those things happen. At least, they don't usually do that. Some dies will have broken or worn out, but we're interested in what most dies do. And the reason we know that they're not removed because they're broken or worn out is because of the ratio of obverse to reverse dies. Let's come back to a basic die studies observation. When the hammer hits the reverse die, the shock is transferred to the obverse die through the blank, which cushions it from the impact. It is still a dramatic physical shock, but it is lessened, which is why the obverse die usually corresponds to our notion of the front of a coin. You tend to put your more complex design, the symbolically more important, on the obverse because you are going to spend more time on it and you don't want it to break as quickly. On the very first die-struck coins, those in Lydia, this is very dramatic and almost certainly a function of the technology. Look at this example. The obverse is a fairly detailed engraving of a lion, but the reverse is just two crude punches. It actually took a few centuries before reverses became relatively complex designs that looked like obverses, probably because the reverse could break and keeping it simple saved effort and time replacing it. That interaction is obviously affected by technology and materials and experience and all sorts of things, but it also comes down to some basic physical phenomena. So we should quite reasonably expect not only for there to be more reverses than obverses, but for the ratio to be relatively stable. And it's not. This is a slide I prepared when I was first learning about die studies in 2008. Yeah, I had to learn this stuff as well. In this slide, I compare about a dozen die studies from different coinage traditions, looking for a common pattern. At the time, it was very popular to say 2-to-1 was a natural ratio for reverses to obverses, and the data I saw didn't seem to suggest to me that that was the right number.
This looks a little unsophisticated. I suspect you could update this today in a much more sophisticated way than 2008 Robert was able to muster. But the main point is...
The point, which I think does hold true today, is that when the ratios diverge significantly from whatever you think the ratio established by basic physical forces is, either very high reverse to obverse ratios, which are particularly common in Hellenistic coinages and very interesting there, or very low reverse obverse ratios, which are common in Roman and medieval English coins, it means that one die has to be used significantly less than the other. So one die face is wearing more than the other. The obverse when the ratio is high, the reverse when the ratio is low. I've given talks which are available online on the coinage of Hovishka, where there is a very high reverse-obverse ratio in the late 2nd century AD, and you can there detect notable die wear on the obverses, but the reverse dies are almost always completely fresh. So no, these mints are not just removing dies when they reach a certain stage of wear, and that arbitrary point of wear is not a stand-in for broken or worn out. This is not just a matter of semantics about how we define mechanical failure. It is literally that the reasons individual dies were replaced at most mints that made hammered coinage for most of history was not due to mechanical failure.
Okay, have I got this right? We know what it looks like when a mint just hits dies until they break, because some exceptional cases of that survive from ancient Palestine. And that is not what most coins look like. When dies survive, many of them have clearly been removed from use without breaking, and existing die studies strongly suggest most mints did not remove a die after some arbitrary fixed amount of wear.
Exactly.
Great, but if they don't change dies because of mechanical failures, why do they change them?
That is an excellent question, and I have a short and succinct answer to it. Most dies at most mints, most of the time, were removed from production for reasons of administrative procedure, such as periods of time, replacement schedules, batches, or some other bureaucratic need.
That sounds a lot like every mint did it for different reasons.
Yes, there are conceivably an almost infinite number of different administrative reasons that a mint might or might not use at any one time, and they could vary from mint to mint and even within the same mint.
Why didn't you just tell me that when you first explained how die studies work?
Well, it's both the time it takes and the number of questions which lead to I don't know sort of dead ends, and not the kind of I don't knows where I just don't know.
The kind of I don't know where you mean that the whole of the academic field doesn't know, where it is still one of those open questions, like why do Hellenistic coinages have such enormous reverse to obverse ratios? For anyone who is wondering what Robert was talking about, it is an observation Francois de Calatai made about 30 years ago. In some cases, from the 4th to 2nd centuries BC, from Egypt to Central Asia, we find a lot more reverses than obverses, up to 10 times as many. And that is weird, because unlike the Huvishka example, there's no big variety of design. You just get lots and lots of the same reverse design being used, way more than it makes any clear sense to use. You are right. You absolutely should do an episode about that.
Yeah, those kind of I don't knows. And that's just bad pedagogy. The point at which I explain this is almost always as the introduction to the first thing someone will learn about intra-die analysis. Morecombe explained it in the introduction to a book on Hellenistic coinage, and it's amongst the first things I say about die studies in general. And the explanation you gave at the start did that in about 30 seconds, with no ambiguity or open questions, or any need to reference a bunch of interesting but obscure research articles. Whereas this took us a lot longer. Obviously, I won't know until I've finished editing, but I guess about 10 minutes. And the questions you raised along the way are ones that occur very naturally. And I had to say, I don't know a lot.
Never good for the ego.
No, it's not. But it's also not good for a student. It is discombobulating to have your teacher keep highlighting gaps in either their own or the field's knowledge on your very first lesson. And we had to dig into some examples to make sense of it, which would probably lose someone who, unlike Isa, doesn't know anything about numismatics. So yes, the lies we tell are there for a purpose. They're not trying to deceive, though they can, if not corrected, do so. They are trying to make the process of learning easier or even just manageable. But if you are listening to this, you probably aren't new to die studies, and you can probably recognise the implications of most dies at most mints most of the time being removed from administrative reasons rather than because of mechanical wear.
The implication is we have no idea what is really going on. We can't know how many coins a die made because it's not a function of how the die physically works. And it was probably a different number at every mint. And you just spent a whole episode on why that is such a big problem. But if it's all administrative, then it's probably an insoluble problem.
Yeah, that's a pretty natural reaction to realising this. It was the reaction Ted Buttrey had to the productivity problem in general. And I think Buttrey was unduly pessimistic, but that's also a topic for another day.
Okay, so we owe the audience an episode about Buttrey and the productivity debate, about de Calatai and Hellenistic dies, and probably at some point you ought to put some time into thinking about why chains are rare. And I guess I've been volunteered into making sure those happen.
Yeah, I think that sums it up nicely, but definitely enough for today. So thank you to Isa for helping me prepare this episode, and thank you for listening.